So my brothers and sisters, this is a video to tell you, to declare to you that Joshua is a prophet of the modern day. And it has dawned on me like a ton of bricks in the last few days. So I need to do this video. So he is a prophet of the modern day and he is still right. Let me show you why. So why don't the naysayers think about it carefully? I do not doubt Joshua's prophecy. And yes, I call it a prophecy because Joshua is not smart enough to come up with the word Exodus, which is the word he said that Jesus used. Exodus refers to the mass migration of a large number of people, usually to seek for a better place to live. If Joshua fabricated this message, he would not be smart enough to use the word Exodus. Instead, he would use the word rapture to get to the point so that more people will catch the message and run with it. But instead, Joshua was faithful to the words that came from Jesus and did not change the words. Hearing that word, Exodus that is, hearing that word gave me goosebumps, and I knew immediately in my spirit that the message was directly from God. The word Exodus is so simple but means so much because the word immediately opens up the whole story of the first Exodus in the time of Moses. No human being is smart enough to come up with that word, Exodus, and everything that it encompasses in the context of this big drama instead of the obvious word rapture. When Jesus used the word Exodus, it was a stroke of genius because by using that one word, he was able to point us to examine entirely the first Exodus that ever happened during the time of Moses. At this point, I have to inject that. Did you know that when Jesus at the cross was saying, my God, why do you forsake me? I only just found out that that was actually the Jewish custom where in order to refer to a certain verse in the Bible, they would quote the first sentence of that verse so that it points people to that passage. And we all know that back in the time of Jesus, a lot of the Jews knew the Torah, which was the equivalent of the Bible, inside out and back to front. So it was easy for anyone to just quote the first line of a certain passage in the Bible to then help people know that they are referring to that particular message. When Jesus was saying, my God, why have you forsaken me?" at the cross, he was actually quoting Psalm 22. This is something that people actually don't know very widely. And this is the problem because they think that at that point, Jesus was actually speaking from the point of a human being. But the real meaning was that Jesus was actually pointing to that psalm, which was Psalm 22. And in that psalm, it talks about how they pierced my hands and my feet. So Jesus was trying to point to the fact that he was just fulfilling prophecy as he's hanging on the cross. He was pointing to the fact that he was actually just fulfilling prophecy. But the modern day world tend not to recognize that, but that's really Jewish custom, that when they quote the first line, it refers to basically when they quote the first line, it then opens up everything that that first line entails. So in Psalm 22, which Jesus was referring to, he was talking about how they pierced his hands and his feet, they divide his garments among them, they cast lots for his clothing, they mock and shake their heads. He said that he was poured out like water and his bones were out of joint. These were the very things quoted in Psalm 22, but it actually, all of these things were completely fulfilled at the cross. So we need to actually know that some of the things that Jesus will be saying to his disciples, some of them are mysteries, and if we read them carefully, we will recognize that there are many layers and hidden codes inside lots of scripture. So when Jesus was verbalizing, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's actually him quoting Psalm 22. So we have to know that at that point in time, he was in fact pointing to scripture that was actually written about 1,000 years ago. So that's why when Jesus says the word Exodus, this is the same thing that we need to grasp. And of course, it comes from just knowing the Bible in depth. So, Jesus, when he spoke the word Exodus, he wanted us to see all the events surrounding that first Exodus, for us to draw from there that there will be a similar pattern that will take place in this final Exodus in 2026. From seeing all the strange and shocking events right before our eyes in the modern day, which match up with the events during the first Exodus, to the fact that back then it was Joshua of ancient times that led God's people to the promised land, spells out to me without a shadow of a doubt that God is the author of all of this. And why so? Because the modern day Joshua, Makala, sorry if I've pronounced your last name incorrectly. So the point is, the modern day Joshua revealed to us that his parents were told by God to name him Joshua even before he was born. Indeed, Joshua, Makala, will be the modern day version of the Joshua of ancient times and the Joshua of 2026 through relaying God's start date of the Exodus like a midnight cry to the people of God to get prepared, will lead so many souls to the promised land, which is heaven, through the message he relayed from Jesus. Again, Joshua in the ancient times led the people out of Egypt to the promised land. So the Joshua of 2026 will, because of his announcement of the date that Jesus told him would be the date of the rapture, he, Joshua, will lead so many souls to the promised land, which is heaven. Now, talk about divine orchestration. Now, what are the shocking events of this world that match up with the events of the first Exodus? Examples of the current signs that match up with the 10 plagues that God brought upon the land in the time of Moses are water bodies turning blood red around the world, skies turning blood red, and legions and storms of locusts and black ravens across the world, strange fireballs raining down from heaven. And I tell you what, all the geophysicists are saying this is very rare. And of course, unprecedented earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, wars and rumors of wars, and so on and so forth. Joshua, with all due respect, and I'm sure he's a very intelligent man, but he is unlikely to be smart enough to come up with so many things that make sense. But they only make so much sense in hindsight, because Joshua himself has stumbled so many times in trying to make sense of God's revelations using his limited human understanding. This is because the Bible tells us that in terms of prophecies, we will know in part and then we will know in full. So just take 1 Corinthians 13:9. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. Now, I know in part Then I shall know fully. This describes how our understanding is incomplete at first, but will be complete in the future in terms of the prophecies from God. Just take the dates of 14 and 15 will pass over, and 16 and 17 is when I will come from my church. These were the next revelation from Jesus to Joshua after Jesus declared the date of the Exodus or the rapture to Joshua to be 23rd and 24th of September 2025. Joshua is not smart enough and cunning enough to come up then with the number 17. And if this number was to make proper sense, it can only mean Nisan 17. Yes, Nisan 17 is the very day that every important thing in the history of mankind has fallen on. And just check out this link, and that's all the proof there for you. So, Jesus was resurrected on Nisan 17. Noah's Ark came to a rest after 40 days of flooding on Nisan 17. Queen Esther successfully talked the king out of annihilating her people, the Jews, on Nisan 17. And I can give you a whole list and a presentation on all the important dates in history that fell on Nisan 17. But you can check it out on this particular site or link there. Joshua is not smart enough to know the big significance of Nisan 17. And even he did not know it meant Nisan 17 when he first heard this message from Jesus in his dream. So again, Joshua is not smart enough to know the big significance of Nisan 17. And even he didn't know it meant Nisan 17 in the first place, and that the 14 and 15 were referring to the Passover, which was what he heard from Jesus. And so he didn't know that 14 and 15 were referring to the Passover when he first heard the message from Jesus. Joshua's human interpretation when he heard this back in October 2025 led him to believe that these dates meant they would take place in October 2025. When it didn't happen, after months of asking God, Joshua realized that these dates were pointing to the month of Nisan, which was the month when the first Exodus during the time of Moses took place. Again, we see it all makes sense in hindsight, that everything is pointing back to that moment in time in history when the first Exodus took place, so that we can expect to know what will happen in the days ahead. If Joshua really set all this up, his narrative would be much more smooth and without so many hiccups, seriously, instead of the very embarrassing way that it has been unfolding for him. Joshua is clearly a person that is not after fame. Just look at the characteristics of his YouTube channel. The channel is very quiet and very boring. Sorry, Joshua. To say the very least. Those are not characteristics of someone who is wanting the spotlight to shine on them. It is so clear to me that here is a man who is just a nobody, who is trying so hard to get the message that Jesus gave to him out to the world in the best way he knows possible. Why should Joshua go through all this trouble to strategize all this? Is he really that free? Does he really have that much time on his hands? And with no gain from strategizing all this, because clearly, Joshua has not monetized his YouTube channel or anything along those lines. The answer is that God has authored the whole embarrassment in order to increase the mocking and scoffing of "Where is your God? Ha ha ha," which has been forewarned by the Bible about the end times. Joshua is not smart enough to come up with the idea that there would be no World Cup this year in 2026, because Jesus told him that it would not be business as usual by then. So there will be no World Cup, and most likely as a result of the rapture. Joshua Bacala said he did not know what the World Cup was, and when it would happen. Many of us are the same, and I am one of them. Therefore, after Jesus gave Joshua the message, Joshua had to go and look up all these things in order to validate what Jesus said. I fully believe him when he shared this full ignorance to what the World Cup was, because I was in the same boat until I looked it up myself. And Joshua is not smart enough to recognize that the Jacob in the Bible is a picture of the nation of Israel and a picture of the end times generation. You see, Joshua said that Jesus said that when Israel is 77 years old, he would come for his church. We must know that 77 is God's sweet spot. It is the number of double perfection. This explains why God has orchestrated for the big event of the rapture to be during the year Israel is 77 years old. Did Joshua really strategize to declare this number just to look smart to the world? Or was it that it was divinely spoken to him? This number 77 perfectly fits with Jacob's story in the Bible like a glove. You see, when Jacob was 77 years old, he saw the ladder to heaven. Jacob was later named Israel by God to hint to us that Jacob would be symbolic of the nation of Israel in the modern day, and it broadens out to the fact that what happens to Israel will, by and large, also happen to the rest of the world in the modern times. This seeing the ladder to heaven by Jacob at 77 years of age symbolizes the rapture of the true believers to heaven by Jesus when Israel reaches 77 years old from 1948 when it was reborn. Then Jacob experienced Jacob's trouble, which lasted 7 years. This 7 years of Jacob's trouble symbolizes the 7 years of tribulation by this modern time generation immediately after the rapture. The parallel is that Jacob worked hard for the trickster and deceiver Laban, a picture of the Antichrist, for 7 years in order to have Rachel's hand in marriage, and Rachel was Jacob's love, the love of his life. Joshua is not smart enough to make all of this converge this perfectly. Joshua is further not smart enough to figure out that there is exactly 7 prophetic years between the Feast of Trumpets on 23rd September 2025, which was the original declared date of the rapture, and the Day of Atonement in 2032, which marks the end of the world. This exact gap of 7 prophetic years between these two feasts has happened 6 times since 1948, when Israel was reborn as a nation. And very importantly, the exact gap of 7 prophetic years between these two feasts would happen for the final time, which is the 7th time, and 7 being God's sweet spot, only if the starting point of the rapture was on 23rd and 24th of September of 2025. And why are we focusing and centering on Israel the whole time? Because Israel was the land that Jesus came to earth and walked among the people. So it is otherwise known as the chosen land of God. This is why we're always talking about Israel. So this 7 years gap represents the period of the tribulation. Based on the above reasoning, if the rapture was not set by God on 23rd and 24th of September 2025, then the parallel with Jacob's life and Jacob's trouble would collapse. But God has already made it clear to us that he reveals the end from the beginning through patterns in the Bible, because nothing under the sun is new. Here is where it says that in the Bible, in Ecclesiastes 1:9, it says, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." And on top of that, Isaiah 46:10 says, "I make known the end from the beginning, from ancient times what is still to come." Why do we care about feasts, by the way? Why does it matter that the two feasts are exactly 7 years apart? This is because God would never orchestrate any significant event like the rapture to occur on a non-feast day. So it makes sense that the rapture is on the Feast of Trumpets, which is a feast day that has not been fulfilled in God's calendar. So out of the 7 feasts of God, 4 has already been fulfilled by Jesus. The next feast to be fulfilled by Jesus on God's calendar is the Feast of Trumpets. So that blank, if you will, looming over the Feast of Trumpets has to be filled by a significant event involving Jesus. But that particular blank spot has stood blank for all these centuries. That is where the rapture comes in. The rapture itself was always hidden in the words, "No one knows the day or hour, not the Son, but only the Father." Here is the explanation in this link. But in short, the idea that the Son will not know when to collect his bride, but only the Father knows, directly points us to the tradition of the Jewish wedding. Remember what I said to you about how the custom of the Jewish people was to quote the first line of something to actually point us to a certain bigger meaning? Well, when we look at the tradition of the Jews, the very phrase "no one knows the day or hour" is actually synonymous with the Feast of Trumpets. So this is not really saying no one knows the day or hour in every sense. Of course, it does mean that, but we must know that it clearly does not mean we will forever not know anything. And we are in the end times generation after all. And don't forget that God has said there will be increased knowledge towards the end times. So anyone that keeps hiding behind the phrase "no one knows the day or hour" is just being slack, and they don't want to read the Bible in its entirety and consider all the other phrases in the Bible that clarifies this phrase. So "no one knows the day or hour" is synonymous with the Feast of Trumpets in the Jewish circle. It follows then that the word trumpet is highly associated with the description of the rapture in Thessalonians. And before I show you the evidence for that, I want to draw your attention to the next part of the same message that Jesus was saying. That next part is "nor the Son, but only the Father." Now, I believe that this part is pointing to the wedding of the Galilean, the Jewish wedding. I believe it's not talking about Jesus saying, "Not even I, Jesus, know the day," because if we remember that Jesus is the Son of God, he is God, there's no way then that the Father would not disclose this information to Jesus. If that were the case, it would be like the Father saying that Jesus is not trustworthy to know of such information, and therefore he would not reveal it to Jesus until the end. And that is just plainly ridiculous. I want to draw your attention now to the custom of the Jewish wedding. Now, with the Jewish wedding, the husband marries the wife, then leaves her and goes back to his father's house and prepares a room for him and her. And the very interesting thing is that the husband, which is the son of the father, does not get to know when he can go back to collect his bride. So customarily, it is only when the father inspects the room and deems it fit for the son and his wife to live in, he then says to the son, "Go and pick up your bride." It is only at that point that the son would run off to collect his bride, and usually at a time that she least expects, but he would customarily send her a type of warning just before his arrival, and usually what they would describe as a midnight cry. So this is all the imagery of the rapture hidden in this phrase. But unfortunately, people are so fixated on this phrase, meaning that even Jesus does not know the time of the rapture, which I feel is very convenient for them because they use this to be lazy and not be watchful. So when we bring together the hidden meanings of these two parts in the one phrase spoken by Jesus, we now know that the first part represents the Feast of Trumpets and the second part represents the wedding. So when we bring together the hidden meanings of these two parts, we now know that the rapture was always going to be set on the Feast of Trumpets. But of course, everybody has seen that the Feast of Trumpets always has the imagery of the rapture within it the whole time throughout history. So for Joshua to announce that Jesus said that the rapture would be on the Feast of Trumpets of 2025, did he really know all these meanings before he strategized to come up with that date? I certainly don't think so. But here, the son and father points to the Jewish wedding. And so while on the line of weddings, this then points us to the wedding in the parable of the 10 virgins. This wedding represents the wedding between Jesus and his bride, his church, which will take place immediately after the rapture. So again, trumpet is linked to the rapture because of the imagery of the trumpet as described in 1 Thessalonians 4:16. And what is it? For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout. Of course, that shout is actually represented by Joshua's announcement to the world. So again, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together. That's where rapture comes from. Harpazo is the Greek word for caught up together. So again, then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And thus we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Yes, the rapture and knowing its day is so comforting to so many of us. So trumpet is intertwined with the rapture. If trumpet is intertwined with rapture, then it makes sense that God has been hinting to us all along that the rapture would be orchestrated to fall on the Feast of Trumpets, which indeed it did, because Jesus told Joshua to tell the world the date of the rapture being in September, and that was the very date of the Feast of Trumpets. But of course, after announcing the rapture date, it was delayed for divine reasons, which will be mentioned below. So what's the other word mentioned in this parable of the 10 virgins? It is the midnight cry, which represents Joshua's bold announcement to the world. This is an official pre-warning to the world about the arrival of the figure of authority, which is the bridegroom, who is Jesus, of course, who can determine if guests were allowed to enter his wedding or not. And the third word in that parable is the bridegroom. So this word is associated with the rapture because the bridegroom was delayed, and the bridegroom represents Jesus, who deliberately delayed his arrival. Then there's sleeping virgins in this parable who represent the world that falls into a state of nonchalance since there have been almost no worldwide supernatural signs from God to humanity for centuries. So yes, understandably, this is why they're all not awake and ready, and they're all asleep. But that's the whole reason why Joshua's announcement was necessary. So the other words were oil and lamp and they represent the level of faith of believers while they wait on God and for Jesus to return. The 5 foolish virgins out of the 10 virgins represent a world that is non-believing and therefore never took the warning by the midnight cry from Joshua seriously. So the 5 foolish virgins out of the 10 virgins represent a world that is non-believing and, of course, a world that is lukewarm. And therefore, they never took the warning, which was the midnight cry from Joshua, seriously, or they never acted on it, which is a big cry. It's a big shame. So when the groom, who is Jesus, actually arrived, these 5 foolish virgins only realized that their faith was not enough to get them into the wedding, which represents the wedding banquet in heaven that immediately follows the rapture. So having established all of that, do you really think that Joshua was smart enough to factor in all of that to then come up with the date of the rapture to be on the 23rd and 24th of September of 2025? And furthermore, is Joshua really smart enough to fabricate the date of 23rd and 24th September 2025 to be the rapture after brilliantly factoring in the following? So firstly, did he factor in that the Feast of Trumpets has not yet been fulfilled and it must be fulfilled by a significant event involving Jesus? Joshua must have strategically worked out in advance that this Feast of Trumpets had to be fulfilled, so he then conveniently threw in the rapture because it has imageries of the trumpet, so it would fit the name of this feast. Really? Is that what people really think about this man who is as regular and as uncunning as one can get? Mr. Joshua himself. So, if Joshua really fabricated the rapture date, then he must have planned in advance that this date would be delayed in order to fulfill in such an incredible way the many prophecies in the Bible, including the increased mocking and scoffing as to why Jesus did not show up. And number 2, the prophecy of the delayed bridegroom and the delayed masters of the house. And also fulfilling the prophecy that if God did not cut short the tribulation years, no one would survive. And here is the link to prove that. So if Joshua really had schemed all these things, he would have hinted at them in the first place at the first interview with the sent twins, rather than allowing so much mud in his face time and time again by not doing so. Okay, as time went on, it was only then that Joshua was given more clarity about the prophecies revealed to him by Jesus through more revelations from Jesus. So is Joshua smart enough to know of the following things if we did suspect that he made up the date of the rapture? So was he smart enough to recognize that almost for the first time, at least 7 different calendars that exist in the world completely agree that the date of 23rd and 24th September 2025 was in fact the date of the Feast of Trumpets? And remember, the Feast of Trumpets was always tied together with the rapture from the beginning, and that's hinted so many times and in so many ways in the Bible. So this means that we can cross off the question of whether the calendar was a factor when it came to the date of the rapture back then, which was intentionally delayed for God's will to be done. So, did Joshua also factor in, if he really devised all of this for God knows what kind of benefit for him, if he really devised all of this, then he must have also considered or recognized that the consensus is that Jesus died in 32 AD. Jesus said he would come back after 2 days, which equates to 2,000 years. This takes us to the year 2032. The year 2032 therefore marks Jesus' second coming. By the way, for the baby Christians, with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. And this is in 2 Peter 3:8. So that's why when Jesus says he's going to come back after 2 days, it equates to 2,000 years. And therefore, from 32 AD, you add on 2,000 years, that takes us to 2032. And Jesus indeed revealed his second coming to Joshua, which will be in 2032, specifically on 15th September 2032, which perfectly lands on the Day of Atonement. Thus, Jesus' second coming will fulfill the 6th feast out of the 7 feasts of God by 2032. This 6th feast is the Day of Atonement. And this YouTube link will explain all the 7 feasts of God right here. Yes, indeed, Jesus' second coming will land on a feast day of God because historically, God does not place any significant event on a non-feast day. This is why no one should ever think that the rapture can happen at any random time. Since we all know that the 7 years of tribulation must happen before the second coming of Jesus, this means that we must subtract 7 years from that endpoint of 2032. When we do that, it takes us exactly back to 2025, which explains why Joshua said that Jesus told him that the rapture would be in 2025, but of course it was delayed deliberately by God. Given all this, Joshua is clearly not that smart to figure out all of this. I've had to study the Bible day and night for so many months. I have had to cross-reference the mass array of wisdom shared in the Watchman community through revelations that God has given them, and I've taken the time to validate all of their knowledge and interpretations through hours and hours of research in order to arrive at this kind of compilation of evidence for over 6 months since hearing Joshua's announcement of the rapture date. So Joshua's announcement was the midnight cry, definitely for me too. Because I too was rather lukewarm with God before hearing Joshua's announcement. The Watchman community for the rapture has been so brilliant in piecing together so many things through their own revelations from God. And together as a big family, we have been able to decipher and decode so many breadcrumbs of hints dropped by God along our journey to the promised land, which is our Exodus, the final Exodus, you guys. Please check out my 25 reasons of why the rapture must be on 23rd and 24th of September 2025, all 25 reasons and more, and definitely the rapture will happen before June 2026. All of these have been compiled on the link to my Facebook page. By the way, for those that are asking why it hasn't happened in terms of this 17 Nisan, well, very quickly, let me tell you, the calendars have been changed. Initially, God used perhaps either the Hebrew calendar or the Enoch calendar. Then mankind decided to change it to the Julian calendar, which was then changed again by Pope Gregory to the Gregorian calendar. I don't know why mankind have decided that they can do a better version of the calendar than the creator himself. So they have taken it upon themselves to change the calendar as if to say that they can perfect what God has not perfected. And it's so sad that they've done that. So this Facebook page, I have set it up since hearing the announcement from Joshua. So I was setting it up for those left behind so that they would be prepared and be expectant of what to expect. And I was also using it to be an alarm for those that were still not awake so that they could all go into the rapture with us. So in summary, if only you knew of all the 25 reasons and more of why the rapture had to be on 23rd and 24th September 2025, but then it had to be delayed, you will be able to clearly see that Joshua could not have known all of this so as to come up with this magnificent date in September, intertwined with so many layers of profound meanings and mysteries by himself. So he couldn't have come up with it by himself, seriously. All of these facts seem to be coincidences on their own, but when they are placed together as a full story, you can see the clear convergence of all the facts to form a very clear picture of why the rapture had to be on 23rd and 24th September 2025. But again, it was delayed for reasons of fulfilling prophecies. But of course, the other one I didn't mention is that God is so the word is long-suffering. God is long-suffering because he does not want anyone to perish, and he's trying to delay as much as he can, and so that more souls can be harvested and more can be spared from the horrific 7 years of tribulation. So, too many coincidences that totally add up, that totally line up, and that totally match up in such a striking way can no longer be called coincidences, but can only be explained that it was God that authored this whole entire magnificent story that will forever remain in eternity as a brilliant climax, a story which we will all marvel at and recall with great awe in countless conversations into eternity with each other and with God in heaven. Why would Jesus reveal the big date of the rapture to Joshua? This is because we are the end times generation, and God has promised in Amos 3:7 that he would do nothing without revealing his plan to his servants the prophets. And God also promised that knowledge would increase during the end times. And why did Jesus not pick an influencer or a big time pastor to announce this news to the world? Ask yourself then, when did God choose anyone famous or a big shot to announce anything important in history? Think of Jesus's birth, the most significant thing in the history of humanity, but how many people were told about his birth? But only the shepherds in the fields, not the leaders or the kings of the world. Think of Jesus's resurrection, the next most important thing in the history of humanity. How many people were told, or only Mary Magdalene found out, and later on about 500 people found out, but none of them were the kings or influencers of the world. Think of Noah and Noah's Ark. Was he a big shot pastor or a priest or some social media influencer of the time? No. Think of Nineveh, which was the city that God was going to destroy. How many people did God tell this to? Only Jonah, who was literally a nobody at the time, not a king or a big shot, just like Joshua Malakela of this modern world. So the list goes on and on. I could go on forever about the reasons why Joshua could not be smart enough to merge all of these elements together so that they perfectly converge to one single point that makes everything make sense. Therefore, Joshua is not smart enough, with all due respect, to cross-reference all these details together in advance before coming up with these dates. You can tell it's not in his character, it's not in his level of intelligence to design all of this, because it would be an extremely sophisticated operation, if at all able to be orchestrated by a human being. And if he did design all of this in order to want to carry out such a grand, elaborate scheme, he must be able to gain something from all of it. So again, and if he did design all of this In order for anyone to want to carry out such a grand, elaborate scheme, he must be able to gain something from all of it. However, in his case, all he has gained is a lot of mocking and scoffing and very nasty judgments from people. Seriously, Joshua could not have the mastermind to have all these elements and details converge so perfectly and making so much sense when we look back with the benefit of hindsight. None of us knew it moving forward into this final Exodus journey, including Joshua himself. We only have all this enlightenment in hindsight. Given all this, Joshua is clearly not that smart to figure out all of this. Joshua couldn't have worked out this whole intricate web of elements that relate to one another so perfectly. Only God can be the author of such intricate webwork of vital crumbs of clues in order that the entirety of His will be successfully carried out on earth before the rapture. All of the above mind-boggling facts, which are just a fraction of so much more, prove why St. Paul describes the rapture as a mystery.